After the blockbuster success of 2001's Grand Theft Auto 3, Rockstar Games shipped 2 sequels in short order, GTA Vice City and GTA San Andreas. These games built on the open-world mayhem of GTA 3, but featured new cities and new time periods. Fundamentally, they didn't drift too far from the formula established by GTA 3, but they made substantial improvements in gameplay and technical ambition. Around a decade after their original releases in the PlayStation 2, these games were ported to modern smartphones in somewhat compromised form, with some aesthetic changes and plenty of bugs. These mobile phone versions form the basis of the GTA Vice City and San Andreas Definitive Editions, which were released on November 11th on current-gen consoles, last-gen consoles, and PC. Courtesy of an engine port to Unreal Engine 4, these new Definitive Editions sport all sorts of new effects and assets, but with somewhat mixed results. It's safe to say that these are not the remasters that we were hoping for or expecting. John published an excellent and extremely detailed overview of GTA 3 recently, which I would recommend checking out, but today we'll be taking a look exclusively at its 2 sequels. So how well do the sun-drenched beaches of Vice City hold up in this new version? How about the West Coast grunge of San Andreas? And how do the games perform across the current-gen platforms? Grand Theft Auto Vice City was a reasonably attractive title back in 2002. The blue-green atmosphere of GTA 3 was out, replaced with a neon-soaked, tropical aesthetic that's rather reminiscent of 1980s Miami. Obviously, nearly 20 years out from its release, many aspects of the visual makeup don't hold up, but there's a level of consistency here that is worth appreciating. Even though the lighting is basic, models are simple, and textures are blurry, there's a basic coherence to the aesthetic, which as we'll see is not the case for this remaster. Unlike GTA 3 and San Andreas, Vice City has a less stylized look that fares somewhat better in this remastering effort, I'd say. The original title has a fairly bold palette that feels more true to life than the aggressively color-corrected tones of the other PS2 GTA games. That's not to say that the colors are unchanged here, but there's a reasonable resemblance to the original at a glance. That's where the similarities end, however. Almost every element in Vice City Definitive Edition has been revamped. The rather flat lighting of the original has been replaced with a dynamic, real-time lighting system. Textures have been AI upscaled and imbued with physically based rendering characteristics. Motion blur has been implemented. Characters have been smoothed out with additional geometry, screen space reflections and real-time cube maps have been added, and water rendering looks much more modern. I could go on and on. There's essentially no element of Vice City that's gone unchanged here. Let's start with what works first. Most of the new effects look reasonably good on buildings, streets, and cars. The real-time cube map reflections in the player car look great, for instance, as do the streetlights and new colored lights. Gone are the odd, matte paint finishes on every car. They've been replaced with reflective finishes that mirror the environment fairly accurately. The new ambient occlusion adds depth to the scene as well, although it's a bit on the strong side. Cruising along Vice Beach late at night really shows off the remaster at its best here. By comparison, the original looks a bit dull. The new particle effects also look great. Explosions, for instance, are much more convincingly rendered and cast light over a broad area. Rampages look much more dynamic as a result. Unfortunately, things start to fall apart when we start to look at more organic and natural elements. Grass and sand, for instance, often look like plastic as they shine and become reflective in the rain. There's new alpha textured grass, which looks okay, but it animates rather strangely when it's trampled over. There's also some alignment issues with some of the new ground clutter, including the grass, which often awkwardly hovers over sloped surfaces. However, these are relatively minor gripes when you consider the Vice City remaster's greatest weakness, its new character models. The original Vice City had rather crude but expressive character models. They were low poly and infamously had club hands without individual fingers, but they worked well considering the technology of the time. These new characters look a bit like clay sculptures of those original models. They've been rounded off with additional geometry and sport new PBR materials, which combines for a bit of an odd look. In stills they can hold up alright, but in motion the results are often comic. There are all kinds of oddities here. from eyebrows that seem to move of their own accord, to telephones that slide up and down as characters talk into them. The fact is, Vice City's animation data was rather crude and was never built for these higher fidelity models. Unfortunately, it really shows. Facial and body animation in cutscenes is a particular weakness. It's really hard to be immersed in Vice City's story when it's conveyed through scenes that look like this. Pedestrians probably fare the worst of Vice City's new character models. Pedestrians in the original game featured low poly models with unique but simple walk cycles. The poly counts have been bumped up here with mixed results, but the walk animations are a real problem. Despite these issues, Vice City probably holds up the best of the three remasters, I'd say. Because the original had less of a strongly stylized look in terms of its color and art, the overall direction of the remaster doesn't err as far from the source material as the new versions of GTA 3 or San Andreas. This is somewhat faint praise, however. From the problems with material properties, to the issues with animation, to the sometimes surreal character models, this is a deeply compromised effort. There are elements that work well in isolation, but taken on the whole, the image really doesn't come together. So it's a very mixed bag for Vice City. Unfortunately, San Andreas is even more messy. Rockstar's ambition ballooned with GTA San Andreas, with a playable area roughly twice as large as GTA 3 and Vice City combined. The game features multiple large cities, over 200 vehicles, including several planes, and a massive, sprawling plotline. The technology became more accomplished as well, with the introduction of more ambitious post-processing effects, including an approximation of motion blur and a higher level of environmental detail. This increased technical proficiency brought a certain look along with it, a look that's highly distinctive. San Andreas has a muted, yellowed look on PlayStation 2, which is driven by the game's color scheme as well as effects like heat shimmer and fog. Cruising around Los Santos, you definitely get a feel for the vibe Rockstar was going for here. Unfortunately, it comes as no surprise that this aesthetic is completely stripped out of the remaster. The color scheme is much more generic now, and there's little trace of the post-process effects that helped define San Andreas in the PS2. There's a huge change to the look, with the warm West Coast haze of the original replaced with a more punchy, clear look. Aside from that, the visual changes are more or less in line with GTA 3 and Vice City. Like those titles, the results, unfortunately, are highly mixed. The new San Andreas features basically the same geometry as in the original game, but is adorned with new textures with PBR properties, new dynamic lighting, modern reflections, new character models, ambient occlusion. Basically, the game has been retrofitted with all the visual flourishes you'd probably expect from a modern game. Outside of the aforementioned issues with color and post-processing, the problems with the remastering effort are more or less the same as Vice City's. I do think that the issues are a bit more obvious here, however, mostly as a product of San Andreas' wider scope than the other PS2 GTA titles. For instance, the lack of any sort of draw distance fog or simulation of atmospheric scattering in the remaster makes the game world appear very small at times. As soon as you get a decent vantage point, the entire world is easily visible, with nothing to obstruct your view or give an impression of distance. Even the water just cuts off at the horizon line without any fading, giving the impression that the world just ends, not too far off the shoreline. Similarly, the far too strong rain effect that is present in the other titles is exposed while piloting aircraft as well. The incorrect sorting that leads bodies of water to be rendered ahead of the rain is very obvious at flying height, and you can mess with the effect by flying at different velocities relative to the ground. If you're careful, you can even freeze the effect by flying at a slight downwards trajectory. The models are a real sore spot as well, even relative to Vice City. Some of the characters just look very off. Kendall, for instance, is a great example of the revised modeling at its worst. Just take a look at this scene.
Hey, she was my mama too.
Not for the past 5 years, she wasn't. And where the f you think you going?
What? Get out my face. I'm going to see Caesar.
The hell you are, girl. You ain't messing with them essays. You know we beefed it. They ain't nothing but a bunch of lowlife.
What the f are you?
At least I got principles.
Oh, and I guess that makes you an upstanding American. Carl, tell him.
Yeah, not great. Her face has been rounded off and features a lot more geometric detail, but has lost all identity in the remodeling process. The remaster's lack of proper cloth physics also sticks out here, particularly on the characters with baggier clothes. Finally, there are some issues with the revised artwork. In common with GTA 3 and Vice City, we're getting a mix of AI upscaled and redrawn artwork here. Sometimes the results are a little messy, but generally it looks okay. However, there are issues here that I feel are not as prevalent in the earlier titles. Much of the AI upscaled artwork here is just incomprehensible, for instance, and some of the artwork that appears to have been redrawn features spelling errors. San Andreas is packed full of this sort of incidental detail, and the results here just don't hold up. We're dealing with 2 games here, across 4 consoles, with 2 modes on each console. That's a total of 16 different modes to discuss and analyze. So to better understand the visual differences, I think it's helpful to group the modes and consoles into 3 tiers. The top tier is the fully enabled visual experience. In addition to the base visual feature set of the game, you get volumetric clouds, improved shadow resolution, and reflective puddles during rainy weather conditions. These additions generally look good, and the puddles in particular stand out here. The volumetric clouds do exhibit some artifacting when they intersect with geometry though. The top tier versions include the PlayStation 5 in both fidelity and performance modes, and Xbox Series X and S in their fidelity modes. For whatever reason, possibly just a bug, the PS5's performance mode retains all the graphical features of fidelity mode, just displayed at a higher frame rate. As a final note, the Series S and fidelity mode lacks volumetric clouds for some reason, but it retains all the other enhanced visual features. The middle tier is the baseline visual feature set of this remaster. This is the game more or less as I've discussed it and showcased it thus far, with all the changes inherent to the new versions of the game, but lacking the additional effects of the top tier versions. The middle tier versions include Xbox Series S and X in their performance modes. Last gen consoles would also fall into this category, although we aren't covering them in this video. The bottom tier lacks a number of features that are quite important to the game's look and feel. Here, we're losing ambient occlusion, high-res textures, motion blur, shadows under point lights, and interior mapping for rooms behind windows. Draw distance is also pulled in quite a bit, especially on shadows. The Switch release falls into this tier. Needless to say, these are pretty substantial cuts. The loss of ambient occlusion particularly hurts. Nothing seems like it has any connection to the ground anymore. To my eyes, this is a substantial visual downgrade from the PS2, which had sprite-based blob shadows under characters and vehicles that somewhat mimicked ambient occlusion. So with that said, let's take a quick look at image quality and performance on each console. For the resolution numbers here, dynamic res does seem to be at play, though it doesn't seem to kick in very much on consoles except for the Switch. Let's start with Series X. Series X renders at an 1800p typical resolution across Vice City and San Andreas in both of its modes. Series X performance mode is an unstable 60 FPS in Vice City, with frequent drops down to 40 or 50 FPS or so. San Andreas fares somewhat better here with a reasonably solid 60 FPS with only occasional drops. It feels smooth enough, although in more intense areas it can spend a lot of time around 50 FPS. The fidelity mode on Series X appears to be a locked 30 FPS across both titles, but there's a catch here. Just like the definitive edition of GTA 3, the 30 FPS cap has been implemented with inconsistent frame pacing. This holds true for the Series X fidelity modes on Vice City and San Andreas, as well as every other mode on every other console that features a 30 FPS cap. There's very frequent stutter as a result. Series S is fairly similar to Series X in performance terms, although image quality does take a hit. We're looking at a 1440p typical resolution in fidelity mode and a 1080p resolution in performance mode. The Series S performance mode tends to hover around 60 FPS most of the time in Vice City, with occasional drops to the 50s and 40s. Things are a little cleaner in San Andreas, with a generally solid 60 FPS interrupted by occasional dips down to the 50s. In both titles, fidelity mode on Series S holds 30 FPS most of the time. There are some dips down to the mid to low 20s in intense scenes, however. PlayStation 5 is a bit of an interesting case. As a reminder, both performance and fidelity modes on PlayStation 5 run with the exact same visual settings with all visual enhancements. Both modes typically run at 1800p, the same resolution as Series X. The PS5's performance mode is quite unstable in Vice City. The readout generally floats between 40 to 50 FPS, hitting 60 fairly rarely. At worst, 30 FPS or so is a possibility. San Andreas thankfully fares much better, with generally close adherence to 60 Hz, only dipping slightly below under heavy load. The PS5's fidelity mode is a locked 30 FPS across both titles, but of course you do get that inconsistent frame pacing. The Switch, perhaps unsurprisingly, doesn't fare well with either of these games. The visual cutbacks are obvious, with reduced visual features, as we discussed earlier, paired with a massively cut back resolution. We're seeing a typical res of 648p in docked mode across both titles. In portable mode, resolution is a bit more variable and tends to hover around 504p in San Andreas and 600p in Vice City. The games tend to look quite blurry, particularly when docked. These cuts might be somewhat forgivable if the Switch performed reasonably. Unfortunately, across both titles the framerate readout in docked mode is very poor. 30 FPS is the target here, but there are frequent drops to the low 20s during typical gameplay. Some of this may be related to streaming, as the framerate tends to stabilize somewhat when standing still or moving slowly. To add insult to injury, of course, the 30 FPS cap has been implemented with the same poor frame pacing we've seen before. Portable play doesn't flatter the Switch version very much either. The resolution cutback isn't too bad, but performance feels every bit as awful as the docked version, if not a bit worse. To summarize, performance across these new versions of Vice City and San Andreas is very poor. No matter which mode you select, no current gen version of the game can hold a truly stable 60 FPS. No console can hold a stable 30 FPS either, owing to a poorly implemented framerate cap with inconsistent frame pacing. And the less that's said about the Switch version, the better. This remastering effort hasn't just produced inconsistent, often garish looking visuals, it's also managed to make 20-year-old games run at a performance level that would be unacceptable for even a graphically advanced, bleeding edge title. On almost every level, these remasters are seriously disappointing. Now, it's safe to say that these versions of Vice City and San Andreas leave a lot to be desired. These classic games have been contorted into versions that look visually modern in many respects, but lack cohesion and polish. Was there a better approach to remastering these titles? Perhaps going back to the roots here would have been a better option. Returning to the aesthetic of the original games, either through an enhanced port of one of the 6th gen console versions, or through a much more careful refurbishing of the mobile versions, would have been a superior choice. Just take a look at the PS2 Classics versions of Vice City and San Andreas running on PS4. These are just the PS2 versions running under emulation, so there are essentially no visual changes outside of a boost to resolution. There aren't any features here from Unreal Engine 4, but you do get effects work and models that are a perfect match for the PS2 originals. That original aesthetic still shines through perfectly in these versions. Instead, the Vice City and San Andreas remasters that we have here are very messy and visually inconsistent. Rockstar Games is known for their extreme attention to detail, as evidenced in recent games like GTA 5 and Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a shame that some of that care didn't find its way to this project. Ultimately, the definitive editions of GTA San Andreas and Vice City are tough to recommend right now. The combination of aesthetic and performance issues make for a really rough conversion of these classic titles. It's a real disappointment. But with that, we've reached the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for notifications for new videos. To view a higher quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. That's all for me for now. Thanks for watching.